So the process by which employees within an organization are transferred laterally between jobs and tasks. So job rotation is where you're transferred, obviously, from within a pay scale or within a department with similar responsibilities. You're transferred laterally from position to position. And the purpose of a rotation is multifold, and you may use it in different ways. But the purpose of the rotation ultimately is that it fosters employee learning, right? That people will learn as they go along. They'll learn the different positions and tasks present. They'll learn all the different elements of how, for example, if you're a manufacturing facility and you're building something, they will learn all the different pieces that go into that task. Sometimes it's really cool because you also find that employees learn that if they do something in task 1, for example, that when they get to task 4, it makes their job easier, right? There's always those little things that people do that, just make someone's job down the line easier because they've done a better job of organizing or placing the part in the right orientation so that it's easily grabbed and installed later. Whatever those small things are, you'll find that folks learn those skills and learn those tips and tricks when they have to eventually perform that other job, right? If it doesn't have a direct impact on me, I may not see those issues, and I may not be motivated to make a change. But when I see how it impacts me, when I get to that position later on in the shift, I can often experience a lot of learning and knowledge increase about how my my individual task impacts people in the future, which is kind of an interesting learning opportunity. Obviously increasing knowledge. It also increases employee motivation. We find that a lot with job rotation, that because of the variety of the tasks throughout the day, it decreases boredom. People are more attentive because they typically spend less time at a monotonous type task, especially when you're thinking about assembly line or production line type tasks where you're doing the same thing for hours and hours on end with a relatively short cycle. Like, think about how many repetitions of that task someone will do if, say, the cycle time is 10 seconds, right? They're doing 6 a minute, right? And add that up over the day. If they do that exact same task all day, that's a huge number of repetitions. So it improves or reduces boredom by rotating them around, and their motivation may also improve as part of that. So we see a lot of reasons why job rotation is beneficial. So I wanted to ask a question here, because this is something that I have conversations with lots of our different clients about. But if you're using rotation, or even if you're not, why do you perceive that rotation is a good choice? Why do you rotate? What motivates you to implement job rotation at your work site? So if you can throw your answers there in the question box, we'll sort of chat briefly about some of them as we move on and talk about, in general, why sort of the majority of people rotate. So why do you rotate? Great. So the first one coming in here is decrease repetition. So that's great, right? Repetition is a key element, especially in a manufacturing type facility. You spend a lot of time doing the same individual tasks. So decreasing repetition by rotating you around. There's benefits on both sides, right? We just talked about boredom, but there are also some physical benefits. Right? Repetition is a risk factor for all kinds of musculoskeletal disorders or ergonomic injuries. So when we decrease repetition, right, the time you spend on that task, ultimately we decrease the amount of times you perform that given movement, which over your days, weeks, years adds up to a lot of repetition saved. Cross-training came up. I've already mentioned cross-training. Different sets of muscles and different tasks is key, right? That's really why, from an ergonomic perspective, that's really why we focus on the rotational element, is that we want to address the fact that each task requires a different muscle group. So your muscle groups are going, you don't want someone to rotate from a task that requires lots of shoulder activity to a task that requires lots of shoulder activity. That's not going to give you the same decreased repetition that was just mentioned and the recovery element associated with using those muscles. So we want to make sure that we're rotating so our muscles get a break throughout the day from the different task requirements. Increased task variation, which is great. Risk reduction, job balance, cross-training, fabulous answers. Modify duties for accommodation is an interesting example. Rotation can be positive and negative in this case, right? When we're using well, first of all, you can definitely rotate people to modified tasks, and that can be part of your rotation if need be. One of the challenges sometimes is that if you have such a rotation that is so set that, you know, it's not impossible to by any means, and certainly you should, but it can be more challenging when people are really accustomed to rotating, but you have somebody coming back to work who can't, you know, let's say there's 4 tasks, A, B, C, and D, and this person coming back to work can do A and B, but not C and D. So you decide to modify the rotation so that individual is only going to be exposed to A for, you know, a couple hours, then B for 2 hours, then A for 2 hours, then B for 2 hours. Whereas everyone else is going to have to go through the rest of the rotation, and they will spend more time in tasks C and D. So sometimes it works to your advantage. Sometimes it can, you know, make things a little bit more challenging. Decreasing repetitive movement by employees, connecting that back to decreased repetition, and accommodation requests came up there again. So that's a great list of reasons why you rotate. And so I've pulled up a few common ones. You'll see that you know, your representative items on my list as well. I think most frequently when we're talking with clients, we hear sort of these 5 things. Reduce fatigue, right, which is sort of connected to the reducing injury. That if you spend the same time, or if you spend all day doing the same thing, you'll find that your fatigue kicks in, right? That, you know, your body gets tired of doing the same task all day. We hear a lot that, you know, decreasing repetition, and although it didn't come up directly in the examples you gave me, I think reducing injury is sort of an indirect reason why we do it, right? If you're decreasing repetition, you're balancing out your muscles that are being used throughout the day. All of those, the ultimate goal is to reduce or prevent injury from occurring, which is great and fabulous. I'm going to come back to the green one here. Cross-training of employees, we've talked about a little bit, and it came up here as part of our thing. It is definitely great to cross-train your employees. It gives you a lot more management flexibility in how you use your team and your staff in order to accomplish a task. So that can be really positive. Reducing boredom, which I also already mentioned. One thing that didn't come up on your list of reasons why you rotate is the reduced exposure to high-risk jobs. So we hear this a lot. So if I go into a training with the Joint Health and Safety Committee and we're identifying hazards present in a job, and then ultimately we work together to come up with a list of recommendations or solutions, job rotation is almost always, and I'm not going to say every time, but is very nearly always one of the things that the Joint Health and Safety Committee members recommend, right? That their recommendation is that, you know, it is an option in order to reduce injury risk and reducing exposure to a high-risk job. And so that's one of those other elements that, you know, may also be on your radar as to why you rotate, is that ultimately it can reduce that injury. And if you have a job that is particularly challenging where you may be able to reduce the exposure time by rotating, then that may be an effective way to manage that hazard as well. So let's talk about the benefits in sort of grander detail. Sort of from a research-based perspective, these are the benefits of job rotation. It reduces that cumulative muscle activity and hazard exposure. So this is connected directly to repetition as well as connected to exposure duration, right? Sometimes by simply reducing the amount of time they're exposed to a task from, let's say, 8 hours down to 4 or down to 2, depending on how low you can get it, right? That cumulative reduction in hazard exposure can effectively manage your MSD hazards, and it can also create that muscular balance that you're looking for throughout the day. So you're not overloading your shoulder muscles or your wrist muscles for hours and hours on end, right? Fatigue, boredom, we already talked about those ones. Increases understanding of all aspects and steps of production, which I sort of alluded to earlier when I was talking about the idea that someone who performs all elements of the task understands how little things that they do as part of the first task in the process can really significantly impact someone's ability to do the last step of the process. So it increases understanding of all those aspects and steps of production, and people gain a better understanding of sort of the grander picture, right? That isn't everyone's thing. Not everyone's is a big, I describe people as sort of big picture and small picture people, right? Not everyone needs to see the big picture, but it pretty much always helps them understand sort of their purpose and their fit on this team and applies an additional value to their job or their role, because they start to understand and see what their little piece of the puzzle means to the overall end product that is going out. Right? So if they make a mistake here, or if they don't do something to the best of their ability, or do that last little quality check every single time, this is ultimately what the end result can be, because they've been in the position where they're doing the final quality inspections and realize that, some of the errors or things that they've done have impacted that final position. Well-rounded training, that's that cross-training element, right? We train many workers, which is great. So typically this has a positive impact on decreasing downtime. So if you have an error or an issue partway through, you have somebody who goes off on leave or on vacation, you have a much better trained staff, and so you're not basically bringing a temp in or bringing an inexperienced individual in to perform that task for a short period of time. Because as soon as you have someone who's experienced, we all know that our productivity and our quality are going to be directly impacted. So if we can keep a high level of training going, that can be really positive. Right? So obviously you get a more flexible workforce as a result of that. And sometimes you'll find that there's some career development associated with your staff as well, that some people excel in certain areas. You start to, are able to identify them as opportunities for other positions or other tasks that perhaps are highly skilled, that they've demonstrated an aptitude for as part of, their, have elements of that task and pieces of the rotation that they've definitely demonstrated an aptitude for in the past. Now that said, as I alluded to already, there are definitely some drawbacks as well. It's not just all pros for job rotation. Job rotation encourages job generalization rather than specialization, which makes sense, right? If I spend 8 hours a day every day at a specific task, then I'm going to get really good at that task. Yes, I may have boredom. Yes, I may have some other issues, but you will see that there are people that do specific tasks all day that I would describe them as they could do it in their sleep. Like they don't even have to think about it. Their movements are super fluid. And if you, obviously if you take the time away, which ultimately is what you're doing in rotation, you're pulling them away. Instead of 8 hours a day exposure, they're now exposed for 2. Now that's going to significantly slow down their knowledge, right? Their experience with that specialization. So that can be a drawback depending on how highly skilled your jobs are. If your jobs aren't very skilled, that's less of an issue because generalization doesn't matter so much. But if your jobs can be, or at least if some of your jobs are highly skilled, and I see this a lot in food. I actually work in several meat processing facilities, and you see this a lot here, that there are some jobs that are incredibly skilled to remove, for example, a bone from a piece of meat, but you want to remove just the bone and not anything extra, right? You want to leave every last piece of meat there because that maximizes the end product, right? And what can be charged for the end product. So you'll see people in those positions become highly specialized and very hard to replace because it is a very unique task. And watching them do it, they make it look so incredibly easy. But if you put someone else who's unskilled on that job, you will start to see just how tricky that position is. So sometimes specialization is incredibly important to success. I'm getting a good question that's coming in here, which is, does this expose more workers to a potential hazard so now everyone has higher potential to be injured? Jordan, I love your question, and if you hold tight for like 2 minutes, I'm going to talk specifically about that as one of the drawbacks. So hold on, I've got a visual for you which will help explain that. So experienced workers, maybe, so if you're trying to implement a rotation with a team that has never rotated before, you're going to get some kickback, right? It's not likely to be really welcomed by a lot of individuals. Some folks, yes, but you'll find that your experienced staff in a lot of cases are reluctant and sometimes even, darn near unwilling to learn new job skills or rotate because they've gotten to a point where their job is, they're so specialized at it, it feels easy to them, right? It's what they know. They don't want to learn anything new. They like being experts at what they do, and when you take them out of their comfort zone and ask them to learn something new where they're no longer an expert or specialist, they may really struggle with that. So sometimes implementing a job rotation can be challenging as a starting process. If you already have one, tweaking one is easier than starting from scratch. Sometimes job rotation is tricky when you have jobs and tasks that don't have a lot of job variety. So when I say that, like you work on an assembly line of some kind. So I'm thinking about some automotive assembly lines I've been to with a whole bunch of weld cells. So they've got, various cells. Let's say they've got 5 positions along this line, and they're adding various parts to, whatever. It doesn't really matter. But they're adding various pieces to this overall large scale part. And so ultimately they have to install multiple pieces each time. Well, there isn't necessarily a huge amount of task variety here. Although yes, there are 5 different positions, when you actually, when the welding curtain actually pops open and they enter the cell to add the pieces that they need to add, when you look at it, they're still working on the same exact size parts. They still reach to the same height. They still reach forward to the same distance. Yes, they may put in pieces that are slightly different weights, right? They may spend a little more time in certain postures or bent over or reaching above their head, for example, depending on how big it is, right? Adding these different components, ultimately the shoulder postures, the back postures, the hand-wrist postures, because you're continuously just adding the next phase or next number of pieces to this part, ultimately the postures and things, there isn't a huge amount of variety. So you may not see a lot of muscular advantage to the rotation. Now that doesn't mean that you can't see other benefits. A lot of those places still rotate. In fact, there's very few automotive companies I go to that don't rotate. But they rotate likely for different reasons. Less physical, more cross-training, looking for their employees to be able to do all the positions, all the knowledge, decrease boredom, that kind of thing, but less muscular advantage to rotation. Obviously, anytime you teach somebody something new, it's slow, right? They're not going to be as good as usual because as your expert worker, because they're learning a new process. So that's going to definitely take them time to get acquainted to the new process and the new system. As mentioned before, some workers may be reluctant or unwilling. Part of that is likely because of stress and anxiety, right? Learning something new and asking, you might even be asking someone who's very new to learn 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different positions. Not everyone handles that kind of volume of knowledge increase very well, right? They like to be very acquainted with, one position before they move on to, learning a new one, and that isn't always possible. So that can be absolutely a challenge depending on how it's implemented, how many positions they have to learn, those kind of elements. Okay, so Jordan asked a great question, which I'm going to highlight here on the next slide, but I wanted to go back and just sort of look at why people rotate. And because reducing exposure to a high-risk job is one of the reasons we often talk about with committees and things, is ultimately this can really be effective, but the question Jordan asked, which is an excellent one, is does this expose more workers to a potential hazard? So now everyone has a higher potential to be injured. And the answer to that question, quite simply, is yes, right? That we sometimes, I'm going to try and explain this in a better way. So let's look at this next slide here, and has a bit of a chart for you. So what I've done here is, this is a very hypothetical. It's not any, obviously they're using nice round numbers. I've just thrown stuff in there. But let's say you have a job that is high risk. It's a really difficult task, right? If you ask anybody in the facility, they would tell you it's the hardest job there. And you have people that will never do it because physically they don't think they don't think they're capable, right? Definitely high risk. So in this example, that is our job D, right? If you look at the red lines, that is our job D. It has a higher risk rating than all of the other jobs associated with it. So in theory, right, and one we hear a lot is, in theory, people think, okay, well, if I rotate that person off, right, if I take person from job D, which is the really tricky job, and I pull them down and I put them into the 3 other, I pick 3 really light jobs, right? So now I have 3 really light jobs and this really hard one. Well, that has to counteract it, right? So I've got this one person doing this really heavy job, but I only leave them in there for 2 hours, then I pull them out and I put them in the 3 easiest jobs I can find at my facility, right? That has to, in theory, counteract the injury risk, right? But Jordan's question is perfect, right? Ultimately, what also that means is, yes, you are definitely going to reduce the injury risk for the person who is dedicated to job D. So if you're brand new, introducing rotation for the first time, you take this job D and you say, oh, it's a terrible job, I'm going to rotate them with A, B, and C, which are really light positions, to save person D from their exposure. You will. Person D Their injury risk is going to go down because their exposure is, let's say, going to go down to 2 hours instead of 8, right? So definitely going to save that. Problem is, persons A, B, and C, their injury risk is all going to go up, right? Because now the rotation is going to put all of those 3 people into that high-risk task. So that's what my green lines kind of represent, is person D, the person assigned to D on the rotation where they're actually pulled off that position, yes, their risk is going to go down. But let's say it only goes down to somewhere around a 2, right? I'm averaging it out. Let's say it's somewhere around a 2. Persons A, B, and C are now going to go up to a 2 because that's the overall risk now present in those 4 tasks. And ultimately what you've done is increased your risk rating by 3. So again, I'm using simple math here for demonstration, but person A's risk went up by a score of 1, person B went up by a score of 1, and person C went up by a score of 1, and person D only came down by a score of 1. So my net loss in this example is actually a score of 2, right? I've increased my risk by 2 in this example, and that's not uncommon. So I actually have a couple clients on here that we were just talking about this with the other day, that they were demonstrating to me a task that they know they're having challenges with. They're looking for ways to improve it, and the question became, is job rotation an effective solution? And what we did was actually run, I actually sat down, I evaluated the job, I reviewed it, and I ran all the numbers. And I said, okay, your exposure right now is 8 hours. You have this employee there for 8 hours doing the same task. So if you want to rotate, let's say we rotate down to a 2-hour rotation. So every 2 hours they go somewhere else, which means they're only exposed to that job for 2 hours. What we looked at is, does dropping their exposure time from 8 hours to 2 hours actually impact the risk present? And the answer in this case was no. That because when you look at an ergonomic hazard, one of the challenges is that there's more than just exposure time, right? It's not like exposure to a chemical where time is the really major component, right? Time and maybe potency. What we're looking at here is there's time, there's the repetition associated with it. Within that time, yes, you do it 8 hours, you do it 8 hours, you do it 2 hours, but how many times within that hour do you do it, right? So it's the frequency and the repetition, right? It's the exposure time for the task. It's the amount of force that's involved, right? So when you start to add in all these other risk factors, you can evaluate that, sure, I'm going to reduce risk, but am I going to reduce it from a high risk to a low risk or even to a moderate risk? And if you're not, then maybe job rotation isn't the right solution, right? This is where one of those times where job rotation may actually hurt you rather than help you, because you haven't effectively reduced the risk. You've actually overall systematically increased your risk. So Jordan, I hope that answers your question, which was an excellent one. Is that making sense to everyone? If you have questions about that, let me know, because this is something that it's hard to explain sometimes when I'm not in person drawing diagrams and other things. So I'm going to keep moving here, but if you have more questions, please shoot them over into the chat bar. That's been great and super helpful. And I don't think I have any new ones coming in just yet. So let's hold tight here. So look at steps to plan a job rotation, right? Because that is the next piece. We've identified that we're interested in job rotation. We've got lots of reasons why we want it. Let's talk about the steps to actually planning a job rotation so that it's effective, right? It's actually addressing the issues you want it to address. So first bits is we need to talk about ideal steps. So we need to determine which jobs to include in the plan, and I'm going to go into these in more detail in the next coming slides. We need to determine what jobs we want to include in the plan, because it's likely not going to be, it may be all of your jobs, it may not be, and we'll talk about why. Determine the workers to include in the plan, and this sort of connects often to the jobs, right? Often sort of workers have specific jobs they're typically assigned to based on skill and experience. So those two often go hand in hand. We want to determine the physical demands of the job, and I'll explain why in a moment, and you've sort of already highlighted some of those things. And then we need to ultimately determine how often rotation should occur. And I think it goes without saying, but maybe I should have added it in here as well, just as a sort of last final element, is we actually need to decide which job to rotate to. Right, that, do you rotate from position 1 to 4 to 2 to 6 to 8 to 1, or do you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, right? You have to actually figure out which rotation you want to do. So in terms of choosing jobs and workers, not all jobs and tasks and workers should rotate, right? And that sort of maybe seemingly goes against what we talked about so far, right? But not all jobs and tasks workers should rotate. Probably the most important factors, and there will be more than just the few I have on here, but the most important factors to consider here primarily include skill level required for the task. Some of your tasks are so highly skilled that you're going to find it really difficult to properly cross-train people in order to be able to do that job. The specialization needed in order to be successful there is going to be your big stumbling block, that somebody really needs to become an expert on that job to be effective. And so if I can't specialize, then I can't achieve the same level. Right, so that's a major issue. Injury risk rating is going to be a factor, right? Just like we talked about previously on the last couple slides, is that not all jobs, especially high risk perhaps jobs, or even low risk jobs, right? Looking at the really opposite ends of the spectrum, not all of those jobs necessarily should rotate, because you may actually be increasing your risk by exposing more people to the same hazards. Sometimes the other factor is geography or layout of the facility. Now, if you can figure out a way to overcome this one, that can be really to your advantage, because you can use, sometimes some of the jobs that will be really great as part of your rotation are really inconvenient from a layout perspective, right? So I was just doing a job rotation review for a meat processing facility, and I wanted them, I think they should rotate. They need to rotate off this specific line. It's all the positions up there are the same, very similar physical demands, but maybe you caught my terminology, up there. This position, all the positions on this one specific area of the facility are up about 15 steps on an elevated platform where the meat comes around sort of at ceiling level rather than at ground level. It's just a different piece of the process, which is great in theory, but from a timing perspective, it's really an ineffective rotation, because you waste so much time just literally getting people up and down from the rotation that becomes problematic. So you have to think about that as well, that it wasn't effective in this example to rotate that line once every hour or once every 2 hours as frequently as the rest of the facility was rotating, because of the geographic location. It just doesn't make sense to move them around that from there. So we had to talk about different ways to achieve that. So that's why we don't necessarily include all workers and all individual tasks. We also want to make sure we assess those physical demands, and several of you highlighted this in the why we rotate element when I asked that question. And ultimately, you need to determine which tasks or postures are considered low, medium, and high risk for the specific tasks you're thinking about including in your rotation. So once you've decided which tasks you think are appropriate to include, now you need to start to evaluate those tasks. So do they have, I mentioned earlier, like low shoulder demands, high shoulder demands. Those are things you want to evaluate. What is the risk to the shoulder on task A? What is the risk to the shoulder on task B? Just as importantly, what is the risk to the back and the wrist and your elbow and your neck and, right? You want to look at all the different components, and then ultimately use that information to determine what an ideal rotation is to balance out your musculature, and using like the actual work on muscle fatigue and combating the stress associated with high exposure levels, right? We want to look at ideal rotation options, and we can only do that once we know what the physical requirements of the task are. So ideally, we're going to use these kinds of things to determine ideal rotation options. Once you know what your physical demands are, you're going to start to look at rotations. Obviously, if you have a low shoulder demand and you're moving to a low shoulder demand task, there's really little risk there, right? It wasn't high demand to the shoulder, injury risk to the shoulder is pretty minimal, so moving them from low to low is not an issue. Moving it from low to moderate or back or vice versa is pretty good option, right? Because I'm balancing out that exposure, and working from low to high and vice versa is also a pretty ideal rotation, because I'm giving that body part that's experiencing the high risk on one job a nice break on the next position, right? So ideal rotations are using your low risk areas and rotating them with low, high, and moderate risk areas, right? Acceptable as well, but perhaps less ideal, is looking at moderate risk to moderate risk area. So I have a job that has, a decent amount of hand wrist activity, and I rotate to another area that has a decent amount of high risk activity. Not necessarily high risk, but that moderate risk area is sort of that gray area. It will cause injury for some people, not for others. So we would love to rotate them down to a low risk and reduce their exposure. If you can't, moderate to moderate's not bad. Again, high to moderate and vice versa still gives you a break, but isn't as ideal as going from high to low. Obviously, the injury risk reduction is going to be less. And obviously not recommended is going from high to high, which is why sometimes going down the line on a production facility or at a manufacturing location is not necessarily the ideal, right? You go from high to high by sometimes the position standing beside you, right? This is a common one that I see. You've got 40 people on some kind of assembly line or production line, right, all the way going down. Some people are using tools, some people are using just their hands. They've got all kinds of different things that they're doing, but you've got, say, 40 people. But somewhere in the middle there, you have about 4 people that are doing the same thing, right? That their task takes a little bit longer, so they do one every 4 instead of they doing every part like several other positions. So if I was just literally rotating them down the line, one position at a time, those people would do that same task 3 or 4 times before they get to rotate off. Right? So that's not just flipping someone to the next position on the line doesn't necessarily make sense. And then you can't just say, okay, well, I'll just move all 4 of those people, because you do that and you don't have people to replace them from literally a layout perspective. So you need to rethink your rotation a little bit more to try and make this, to try and manage the issue a little bit better. Right? But it is important that if one of our goals is to improve the physical requirements of the job by reducing exposure time, and we know that reducing exposure time will actually reduce risk, because like I mentioned before, that's not always the case. It might not be exposure time that's the issue. It might be weight, right? It might be the fact that they lift a 75-pound box once every half an hour that's actually the risk. So reducing that, it's not going to go down. It's not going to go down. You're still going to have high risk behaviors there. Right, so you want to make sure that works. Once you do, you start to look at these rotation options and evaluate which jobs are good pairings to go together. Next question you're going to need to ask is, how often should we rotate? Ultimately, the message is rotate as frequently as is practical. Right? We know, and I'm sure you can, one of the drawbacks of rotation, which I'm not even sure actually was on my slide now that I think about it, is that it's slow. Right? Job rotation can slow you down because you have somebody off the line for a short period of time. So one of your skilled employees is even if it's only for 30 seconds, is 30 seconds of non-productive time. And if you add that up over the day, depending on how frequently you rotate, you may actually have several minutes of downtime. And in some industries, several minutes of downtime is a huge issue, right? That is a huge cost, huge expense that they can't afford in order to be competitive. So you want to think about how that rotation occurs, right? If you can get your rotation going every 30 minutes, then talk about boredom reduction, right? But then is 30 minutes, if you have a long cycle time, 30 minutes is probably not practical, because they might only do 10 or 20 before, maybe, let's say it takes a minute to do their position, whatever task they are assigned to. Well, they're only going to do 30 before they rotate to the next position. Well, I got news for you. The first 5 are them going to be like getting into the rhythm. Then the next 20 they'll do pretty well at. And then the last 5, their brain is on the fact that they're about to rotate away. So you really only get 20 or 2/3 really good quality production in there, with a handful that are slower and or less effective or less decreased quality, because perhaps they aren't able to, they aren't just jumping right into a task they're super comfortable with, right? So 30 minutes in those examples maybe isn't effective, but I have some clients who have a cycle time that is 3 to 6 seconds long. Well, in that case, 30 minutes might not be a bad rotation, because they do so many repetitions in such a short period of time. Getting them off of that and onto the next task may actually be a really effective way of managing some of their issues. Right? Probably the most frequent rotations I see are more likely 1 to 2 hour rotations, and probably I would say most frequently 2-hour rotations, that once every 2 hours you rotate. There are some very obvious practical examples associated with this. Every 2 hours is likely approximately a break time, and so when people come back from break, there's no downtime or less downtime, because they come back from break, they go to their next position, right? And then they work to the start of their next break, they leave, they come back from that break, and they go to start their next position. So there's very little downtime in terms of actual skilled manpower away from the production line. So 2 hours has a very practical attachment to it. And sometimes it's 1 hour and 45 minutes, sometimes it's 2 hours and 10 minutes, whatever it works out to be. But that sort of magic 2-hour mark seems to be a good one. One of the things that we do encourage, for example, I talked about this production facility I saw the other day, a meat processing facility, and they have 15 odd steps up to this other platform where they do this work. It is not very practical for them to even rotating every 2 hours. They don't actually all take breaks at the same time, so it's not a 2-hour rotation doesn't really help them because their break schedules are all different. But they all take lunch at the same time. They actually shut the whole line down for lunch. So a 4-hour rotation makes sense in their specific work site for that one job that is way up on top of the platform, right? Because it's going to be hard to get them down in a timely manner. But if I rotate them after lunch, for example, once per shift, they all come off that line and a whole new set of 6 or 7 people go up there. That is probably the most effective approach to rotation for that line. Right, so you need to really think about all the different elements and try a few of them out. You may start with a 1-hour rotation or a 2-hour rotation and start to look at what are your goals, right? Is your goal injury reduction? Are you reducing injuries? If you're not, then maybe you need to evaluate, do we need to go to a bigger rotation, a more frequent rotation, so that employees get more breaks and their muscles get more rotation, or whatever that may be. So you need to start to think about this though, but it is determined by practicality, so break times, right? Shift schedules, how break, lunches, etc. work. It's also determined by cycle times, if you have a cycle time that's relevant, and you work from there. Daily and weekly rotations are less common and less effective, to be honest. You see sometimes you see those in hospitals and other environments where you rotate to with different patient groups, for example, on a weekly rotation or even a bi-weekly rotation, and that can be effective, but ultimately from a muscular break perspective, it doesn't have the same impact because you are still going to have a cumulative 8 to 12-hour exposure, and then ultimately your break comes 2 to 4 weeks down the road, which may be you may have already developed your injury or your discomfort by then, that you're not getting the break from. So daily and weekly rotations aren't as common and are definitely not as practical from an injury reduction perspective. Pardon me. So let's talk lastly about requirements for an effective job rotation. So multiple rotations per shift, either as I just talked about, we want to rotate as frequently as is practical. Different physical demands versus similar physical demands, which I've already talked about, and I've given you sort of a visual of what that looks like. So one of the clients we were just working with, they had jobs there, A, B, C, D. Sorry, that last one should say E, but ultimately jobs A, B, C, D, E. And we looked at the little red X means it's a high risk for hand, wrist, or a high risk for shoulder. Little green check marks means it's low risk, and yellow is sort of in the middle. So we started to look at this list, and they had a list of, let's say, 15 or 20 positions, and we started to identify which ones had high hand wrist activity, high shoulder activity, and which ones had a balance. So in this case, the first job D, which it should be job D, has low and moderate risk in those areas. So that was identified as a good opportunity for rotation. Right, that you might actually be able to use that job D as a really good rotational strategy. Now, is it going to be challenging for them to effectively rotate in this example? If these were all the jobs they had 5 jobs, and 4 of the 5 jobs all had high hand, wrist, and shoulder activity, this rotation is going to be very difficult from a muscular perspective to manage because there really is nowhere to rotate with the exception of one job to reduce your risk. Right? So this might be an example where rotation just with 5 positions wouldn't have worked. With this client, I had another 10 or 12 positions to consider in the elements, and we were able to give them some pairings that we thought were a good opportunity for them to start to look at. This would be well suited to go with this one in order to effectively manage your hazards. Really, one of the main things we need to focus on here is that you're asking people to learn a lot of different skills and tasks and be ultimately as expert as they can get at all of them. So comprehensive training programs for all jobs is key. And a common way we train on a lot of different manufacturing and production facilities, in my experience, is pairing a new individual up with a skilled worker that you've had for a long period of time. And the key element here to remember is that you want to focus when you're pairing those individuals up. You want to focus on people who not only are skilled, but do it the way that you believe is best, right? Just because one of your employees is really skilled at doing it doesn't mean that they're actually muscularly efficient, right? That they may do a bunch of extra things, an extra handle, an extra flip, an extra cut, or whatever it might be, that in their head makes their job easier, but actually adds some work to the job. So we don't want to be training new employees on things that aren't required. So yes, you want them to know what makes it easier for someone down the line, but you need to keep in mind that this task is not necessarily meant to do that extra cut, although yeah, it saves them when it gets down to position 4 from having to do it, but there is a reason that it was broken down into position, 1 does this and position 4 does that, right? So if somebody sort of oversteps those things and teaches a new person the wrong ways to do it, then that can be problematic. They may also teach them just poor work method skills, and that's not great either, because then you're even something that is looking at like a yellow hazard, right? So in this example, our job D is a yellow hand wrist. If they do that, if it's a cutting job, if it's a knife job, and they do it really poorly, they may actually increase their risk. So by demonstrating poor work methods can be problematic as well. So make sure your training program addresses that. We want to make sure we're training using the best work methods, even if we're using our current employees, right? So identify knowledgeable, skilled employees who also use the best work method. They are not always the same individuals. So you also want to make sure you spend some time performing effective follow-up assessments of the job rotation, right? So conduct worker interviews and surveys, get them to evaluate how things are going, get their input on the issues, and ultimately compare injury rates before and after implementation. Right? So if injury was one of your goals, right, or if productivity was one of your goals, or if cross-training and job assignments or whatever your targets and your goals were, or all of those things, you want to make sure that you're properly evaluating them. Did you actually achieve your goal? And if not, you may need to revisit your rotation, right? It's not always you get it right on the first try. So this is the kind of thing we were working with our client to identify, right? So this is a poultry facility, so they had a position who was a trimmer, right? And ideally, these are some job tasks that they had high hand, wrist, and high shoulder activity. These are some job tasks that had low to moderate hand or wrist and shoulder activity. So these would have been good rotations, right? Trimmer could rotate with inspector, neck slitting, et cetera, et cetera. These 4 jobs below that had high risk for the shoulder. They could rotate with any of these positions as a logical next step. We're not even necessarily saying that they can't go back to one of these positions in the future, but you don't want to go from high shoulder activity to high shoulder activity, right? So go from high to low to moderate, and then if you needed to go back to high because you have limited other options, you could do that, and then again look to rotate between low and moderate as possible, right? So just looking at how you start to pair these jobs up. And now this wasn't necessarily handled from a geographical perspective, so a layout of the facility. We were strictly looking from our perspective, our involvement in this process was these are good pairings based on musculature usage. The next step is for the client to take this and go, okay, I mean, I had some idea because I'd seen all these jobs, but the next step would be the client would take this and start to figure out what is practical from a rotation perspective. For example, the trimmer position is might be 12 or 16 or 18 positions away from neck slitting, which isn't necessarily a practical rotation from downtime perspective. So in that case, they may have rejected that position as an option, right? And you can work through that as you need to. So ultimately, just the sort of final message is where you begin. I thought it was important just to go back and talk briefly about the importance that you need to first consider about how you approve your jobs in other ways, right? Ultimately, an ergonomic risk assessment is the first element that needs to be addressed, is that what are the opportunities for improvement? As we talked about earlier, exposing more workers to a potentially high hazard job is not going to reduce your risk. It's ultimately, from a systematic perspective, going to increase your risk. So we want to avoid doing that whenever humanly possible. To do that, we have to make change to the job that's high risk, right? You have to look at it and figure out, are there opportunities to make this job easier? And if there are, how do we go about taking those and actually implementing some of those change solutions so that we can effectively reduce our risk and then ultimately move on to the next element, which is figuring out how to rotate them. But you want to focus on how can you reduce the risk in these high-risk jobs in order to effectively reduce risk overall and make that in a better rotation. Because now you have maybe one more job that has a moderate risk at your shoulder level rather than high, which you can use as a good rotation option. Right? So reduce overall risk first rather than use rotation to solve the issue. So focus on those engineering controls, right? And job rotation can be great, but it does have some specific drawbacks. So focus on those engineering controls first, and then move on to your administrative controls like rotation. So I have about not quite 10 minutes before 3 o'clock. I just want to open the floor up to some questions at the moment about job rotation. And I know some of you have it, some of you don't. Questions on all levels are welcome. So let's see what you think, what questions you have about job rotation, and I'll stay online for a few more minutes here. Question is, what financial savings have you seen from job rotation in your experience? And that's a great question. I'm honestly, quite honestly, I'm not going to be able to put a dollars and cents element to it for you because it really varies depending on the client individually. So for example, probably the biggest potential savings is an injury risk reduction, and that's obviously the prevention of one or more injuries from year to year. So looking at clients who have effectively been able to reduce their lost time claims and their WSIB claims from year to year, that's where they're going to see financially their biggest benefits, which unfortunately in many cases are not numbers that we have access to after the fact. But I can tell you that it's been effective because we've been back to do job rotation again in other departments. So they're definitely seeing financial savings. I just don't have exact numbers for you. But that's a great question. Another always question is, will slides be available post-webinar? We've stopped posting our slides because my slides don't mean very much without me chit-chatting about them. So what we ultimately will do is post this webinar on our YouTube page and share the link with you. So you'll be able to access the webinar and all of my sort of chit-chat today about job rotation all together. I'm not seeing any other questions come in just yet, so I'll be online for another few more minutes. Thanks again for everyone for attending the webinar today. I hope you gained a little more inside knowledge about how to effectively use job rotation to evaluate the one you have or start a new one if you're interested. And we're always open and available, happy to have our brains picked about what might be an effective rotation, how might you implement this, what are some challenges we've seen, or some suggestions we have, because we are always available for that kind of stuff. So feel free to shoot us an email, and we're happy to help. Hope you guys have a great day, and we'll connect at the next month's webinar.